Hi everyone. Not sure if you can hear me, um, but here we are. This is the first time I'm doing a Facebook Live for Sleepless and Nola to talk about all things sleep related with your kiddos. So write a comment with a question and we will discuss it here. There have been a couple of questions so far. Let's see, from Karen Paymani. She said, we are struggling to get our 18-month-old to sleep through the night and not in our bed. How can we transition him to a toddler bed? Also, how can we get him to sleep through the night without crying for a bottle? We struggle with him eating a lot during the day because he's very picky. So my approach is very holistic. I feel like you can't deal with sleep issues if you don't deal with the feeding issues as well. So you have to make sure that they're getting adequate intake during the day. And if they're not, they're going to be up requesting a bottle overnight. And if you're unsure if they're waking up at night because they're hungry or if it's just out of habit, one of the ways you can ensure that they are getting adequate intake during the day is to really focus on making sure they get that intake. So if he's getting a bottle overnight, let's say it's 6 or 8 ounces, sometimes parents have told me they're giving their kids even 10 or 12 ounces overnight. So if they do, that's 10 or 12 ounces that they're not going to take in during the day. So work on decreasing the overnight intake so that you can start making that daytime intake. And that should help eliminate the need for the bottle overnight if he's getting everything that he needs during the day. And then if he is getting everything that he needs during the day and he's still asking for a bottle, then you know it's more, he's doing it more so out of habit. And then as far as your question about transitioning him into a toddler bed, I typically don't recommend transitioning them to a toddler bed until they're nighttime potty trained. That can be as old as 2 for some kids, as old as 4 or 5 for others. So keeping them in the crib as long as possible. Obviously, if they're jumping out of the crib, then you have to transition to a toddler bed. But if that hasn't happened yet, then it's best to try to keep him in the crib. And establishing a routine and letting him know that this is kind of what happens. You do a nighttime routine, whether it's reading books, singing songs, rocking him for a little bit, sitting with him in the bed, but making sure that you're leaving before he falls asleep. What happens a lot of times and why toddlers wake up overnight is because the parents have to stay in there or do stay in there until the child falls asleep. And then when the child wakes up at the end of those sleep cycles, they're looking for the parent who was in there as they were falling asleep. And so if you can leave the room before the child falls asleep, that's going to be easier for him to get back to sleep when he wakes up overnight at the end of those sleep cycles. Hi, Megan. He said, hello, I need help with my 11-month-old sleeping through the night. We are desperate. Can you tell me a little bit more about what's going on and why he's not sleeping through the night? Is he waking up for bottles or to nurse? And then what are you guys doing when he does wake up overnight? So Kelsey, you said your son's going through a 6-month sleep regression. Any tips on how to get through that? He was sleeping through the night. So again, what is happening when he wakes up? Is he crying and then you go in and rock him or hold him or nurse him or feed him back to sleep? If so, then a lot of times kids just get used to having that interaction. So figuring out what the reason is that he could be waking up. Is it a growth spurt? Is it a developmental milestone that he's going through? In that scenario, it may only last a week or two, that regression. As long as you stay consistent, every time he wakes up, he should be able to get back to sleep easily. So if he's still having issues, oh, he's screaming pretty hard, you said. we'll give him the binky but not pick him up. So that's a good idea. Comfort him, let him know that you're there, that you love him, make sure it isn't a dirty diaper or wet diaper, he isn't too hot, isn't too cold, there isn't anything wrong with him. And then comfort him. You can stand over the crib and pat him and rub him, put your hand on his chest, and then try to take your hands off of him a few minutes before he falls asleep. If you're in there as he's falling asleep, then every time he wakes up, he's going to expect you to be in there to put him back to sleep. So yeah, so if he just started to learn to roll over and started solids, those are all new changes that can affect sleep. But again, it shouldn't last more than a week or two. Hi, Britton. He said, help, 2.5-year-old falls asleep 7:45 to 8 p.m., but still wakes up 2 to 3 times a night hysterically screaming. She won't stop until I pick her up and comfort her. So again, if you're in there as she's falling asleep, then when she wakes up at the end of those sleep cycles, she's going to expect you to be in there and cry and cry and cry until you go in and recreate that same environment that was there when she was falling asleep. So try when you're doing the bedtime routine to say goodnight and leave before she falls asleep. If she's having a hard time, you can go in and sit with her again for a few minutes, and then you can make excuses like, oh, I gotta go potty, or I gotta go get a drink of water, or I need to go turn on the dishwasher or whatever, and leave for brief periods of time until she falls asleep independently. And that's what's going to fix the potential waking up overnight hysterical, because she's used to you being in there when she's falling asleep. And if you're not in there when she wakes up, it's going to create a sense of anxiety and distrust. So make sure you're not in there as she's falling asleep. Okay, Megan, you said we did Ferber at 5 months old. He goes to bed in the evening like a dream. I leave before he falls asleep, and he always goes down wonderfully. He goes to school Mondays to Friday and seems to eat well, I think, according to his daily reports. Bottle at home in the AM, fruit and cereal at school, usually bottle at school, and more solids for lunch. So, so he falls asleep fine independently, and you leave before he falls asleep, but is still waking up multiple times overnight. So what is it that you do once he said he can self-soothe, but more nights than not he gets hysterical? So when you go in, so when he does get hysterical, what do you do? Do you go in, comfort a little bit, and leave again before he falls asleep? I would make sure that even though he's falling asleep independently, if he's waking up overnight, that you're going in there, giving him a few minutes at first to settle himself. But if you're going in there multiple times overnight, making sure you leave before he falls asleep, so that he doesn't get used to you being in there as he's falling asleep. So go in there, comfort for short periods of time, and then leave and let him do a small little stretch on his own, and then go back in, comfort, but make sure that you're not in there as he's falling asleep. Britton said she goes to sleep on her own. Okay, so she's going to sleep on her own, but still waking 2 to 3 times hysterical. Does it seem like a night terror where she's like not really aware of what's going on, or is she talking to you and communicating? Because if it seems like she's just kind of screaming and not really with it, then one of the things that you can do is try, and especially if that's happening every night around the same time, you can try to break that sleep cycle by going in and kind of rousing her, not until she's fully awake, but just a little bit until she's almost asleep, but not quite asleep. Almost kind of aroused to where she's a little stirred, but not awake. Sometimes by doing that, you can break the sleep cycle, and then she'll transition to the next sleep cycle and not have that next wake up. So try that and let us know if it works. try that tonight. Megan said, we practice the 5-minute rule. After 5 minutes of crying, we go in and soothe, but leave him in the crib and give him a binky. I think you're doing perfectly fine. If it seems like it's going on for longer stretches of time, just make sure that you're doing the exact same thing, whether it's you or another caregiver, that you're going in at the same, doing the same thing, saying the same thing, comforting him, making sure there's nothing going on, and then leaving. If sometimes you go in and pick him up and feed him, and other times you just go in and leave him there and just pat him in the crib, or if sometimes you pick him up, it's going to create kind of confusion for him. So just make sure that you're doing the same thing every single time that you go in, and it shouldn't last more than a week or two, especially if it's because of a growth spurt. Okay, so if after 3 or 4 cycles he's hysterical, Megan says, then you make a bottle and rock him, then he's kind of figured out, like, okay, I just need to fuss for this period of time. Not that he understands time necessarily, but he's like, I know at some point they're going to give in and give me a bottle. So if you, like I was saying earlier to somebody else, make sure he's getting adequate intake during the day, because if there's any doubt in your mind that he's not getting adequate intake during the day, at night when the wake-ups continue, your first thought is going to be, could he be hungry? And if so, then you're going to feed him. And especially if you're like, well, he shouldn't be hungry and I'm letting him fuss, but then I'm going to go ahead and feed him anyway, it just kind of teaches him to fuss for longer periods of time until he gets that bottle. So go through the sort of his daily intake, make sure he's getting adequate intake, talk it over with your pediatrician for his age and weight, how much he should be ingesting during the day, and try to get that intake in during the day. And then once you decide that he doesn't need the intake overnight, then don't feed him overnight. Go in 20 times if you have to comfort him with each wake up. Whether you decide to pick him up and then put him down, or just comfort him while you're standing over the crib, whatever you have to do, go do it consistently each and every time. And don't give in with the bottle, especially once you're sure that he doesn't need the intake overnight, because then you're just perpetuating the cycle. Kelsey, do they have night terrors? Not typically. If they are night terrors where they're like not aware of what's going on, then it can be a sign of just overtiredness during the day. I think, Kelsey, you said your child is 6 months of age, so he should be needing 3 to 4.5 hours during the day of sleep, plus 12 hours overnight. So if he's not getting adequate daytime sleep, it's possible that he's waking up screaming because he's just overtired and doesn't know how to soothe himself back to sleep. So I would make sure that he's getting those naps during the day, and then, you know, providing the proper place for him to sleep, as well as the amount of time to sleep adequately during the day, and then see if that resolves. Megan says, okay, thank you. I feel like he's not getting enough calories during the day, so I usually cave in. And I think, like I said earlier, like for babies, they don't care whether they get all their calories in during the day or at night, as long as they need, as they get what they need during the, you know, the course of the 24 hours. So if he's getting 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 ounces overnight, then that's intake that he's not going to get during the day. So try decreasing that intake at night by a couple of ounces, and then increase it by the same couple ounces during the next day. And that way, gradually over time, if you decrease the amount of intake he gets at night, you don't have to do a cold turkey, and increase that same intake during the day. And once you know, okay, like he got 32 or 35 ounces during the day, plus his solids, I know he's not hungry. So then you can kind of stay, you can stay strong, I guess. And the times that you're like, well, I don't know, you give in, that's when things fall apart. So try to set that foundation up first, make sure that he's getting adequate intake during the day, and then start working on, you know, and also at the same time work on decreasing the nightly intake. And so then once you've eliminated or gotten close to eliminating the overnight intake, then you can feel confident that if he's waking up, it's not necessarily because of hunger, it's just out of habit. Okay, I think I got everyone's questions. I hope this is helpful and I hope this is making sense. I'm trying to get each question as they come. I think we had another question over here. Leslie, my 6-week-old sleeps well if someone is holding her and somewhat in the swing, although I only let her sleep in that if I'm awake. But if we put her in the crib or pack and play, she's awake within minutes, even if she's just eaten a decent amount. So the problem typically with that is if you're holding the child to sleep or feeding them to sleep and then putting them into the crib gingerly and walking away, that works in the newborn period. But once they get to be anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks of age, they become a lot more aware of their environment and surroundings, and they're starting to pick up on like, hey, I am asleep in my caregiver's arms at one point, and then I'm waking up alone in the crib at the next point. So their little alert system starts going off in their heads as soon as they feel that sort of altitude shift from your arms into the crib. And a lot of times their eyes pop open the second you start putting them into the crib. So the key there is to make sure you're putting them into the crib, drowsy but awake, pack and play, bassinet, whatever, drowsy but awake, and letting them fall asleep in the crib on their own. It's okay if you're standing over them, helping them a little bit, rubbing their head, patting their back, making sure the passy stays in, but trying to leave a few minutes before they fall asleep. There's just, it's just human nature that if you're in there when they're falling asleep, they're gonna end up waking up multiple times overnight or even through that nap and then no longer take that nap because they want you to hold them the rest of the way. So Megan said you're lucky if he takes 20 ounces during the day, and I think you said he's how old? 5 months old. Yeah, he should be getting a little bit more than that. You want at 5 months for him to be taking 4 to 5 ounces per feed every 2.5 to 3 hours. So that may be something to discuss with the pediatrician as to why he's not taking a lot of intake. Some kids what happens is, especially if they're feeding a lot overnight or feeding so close to wake up time, they're not quite hungry when they first wake up, but then they get hungry right in time for the nap, and then they start feeding, but then they get sleepy, so they don't fill up on that feed. And then the cycle sort of perpetuates and they get used to feeding to sleep. So, and then they just get into the habit of only feeding when it's time to go to sleep and they don't feed well and then they're hungry at night. And like I said, the cycle perpetuates. So try to really push the intake during the day to make sure he's getting adequate intake, even if it means you're feeding him every 20 minutes or so. Initially, just in the sort of experimental phase, making sure you're feeding him an adequate amount, even if you have to feed him multiple times within that period of time from when he wakes up to when he goes down for the nap, making sure not to feed him to sleep so that you can ensure adequate intake during the day. Holly said, my 2-year-old groans in his sleep and wakes himself up with it, and literally the only thing that stops him is a bottle. Last night I had to bathe him at 2 a.m. because he was soaked from so many bottles. Oh no. Okay, so a 2-year-old should definitely be capable of sleeping through the night. And like I said earlier, if he's getting so much intake at night, he's not going to take that intake during the day. And so you have to start working on decreasing the amount of intake they get at night and increasing that same amount of intake during the day so that they can start getting their calories during the day. A lot of parents tell me, oh, I'm fine with my child feeding once or twice a night because they feed and they go right back to sleep. But the problem with that is that then their bodies are working to process that meal instead of resting and regenerating for daytime activities. Plus, they're not going to be as hungry during the day, because within that 24-hour period, they got 6, 8, 10, 12, maybe ounces overnight, and that's 6, 8, 10, 12 ounces they're not going to get during the day. So work to decrease that intake. So, you know, it's best to not do it cold turkey, just because it's then easier for everybody, but decrease it by an ounce or two every night, or every couple of nights, or every week, to where the child doesn't quite notice it and realize that you're doing that. And then make sure you're increasing that same amount of intake that you're decreasing overnight during the day. And that way they're still getting what they need. And then once you feel like, okay, I've gotten rid of all the intake at night, replaced it with daytime intake, and they're still waking up every 3 or 4 hours, then you know it's because of habit and not because of hunger. And that's when you can be a little more assertive or aggressive and try to get them to, or intensive to get them to sleep, knowing that they're not hungry. It's when that middle of the night wake up happens and you're not quite sure if they're hungry or not, that parents cave in, because that's, you know, you feel like that's your job. I've got to feed my child. So if they're hungry, of course I'm going to feed them. But if they got that intake during the day, you won't feel like you need to feed them so much at night. Oh, that's really hard, Holly. So we do want to keep him quiet, and but so that it doesn't wake his sister up. But we're not helping him out by giving him all that intake, because like I said earlier, his body is then working to process that meal instead of resting. So even if it means you know, turning fans on, or like really loud window fans or whatever for a couple of days, for a weekend, for a period of 2 to 5 days, where someone kind of takes care of his sister, so that in case she wakes up, they help her get back to sleep, so that you can focus on making sure that you can decrease the intake for your 2-year-old. Because again, it's not doing him any favors to give him all that intake overnight. His kidneys, intestines, stomach, liver, everything's working to process that meal instead of resting and regenerating for daytime activities. So even if it means his sister gets a little bit of a couple of days of not so great sleep, so that you can work on really getting the 2-year-old sleeping through the night. Although her brother. So is he pulling his hair or your hair? Because regardless, it doesn't matter. If you can replace that hair pulling with like a toy or a doll that has hair, and you know, if he's pulling your hair, kind of keep transitioning his hands onto the hair of the doll. It'll help him. So a lot of kids have like a need to either suck on something, suck on a passy, a finger. Some kids like to suck on loveys, or pulling on things, or playing with things. That's all fine, but try to replace whatever that he's pulling on. If it's your hair especially, have him replace it with, you know, replace it with a doll or whatever, something else that he can replace it with, so that you're not always necessary to get him all the way asleep. He can potentially self-soothe sometimes. Any hair he can get his hands on in his sleep. So yeah, I think a doll would be a good idea, so that he can have that tactile sensation as he's falling asleep and when he wakes up overnight, to get himself back to sleep. I wish he was just normal with the pacifier. I know, but then, you know, pacifiers are great, and then sometimes they're really hard to get rid of. So you got to do what you can do if he's not into the passy. And you can litter the crib with a lot of passies and practice with him during the day as well, when he's sitting on the high chair and after he's done eating. Give him a bunch of pacifiers to practice with. He may get it, and especially if he's practicing during the day and you put them in his crib at night, he may be like, oh yeah, I know this thing, and put it in his mouth and comfort himself. So just because it hasn't worked in the past, or a child has refused a pacifier in the past, doesn't mean it's no-go forever. You can always reintroduce it and retry it as they get older. And so give that a shot, or like I said, the doll with hair. And you know, if he's old enough, I think he said he's 2, so yeah, he might be. You might be able to bring him to the store and have him pick out a doll or a toy that he likes. Make sure it doesn't have any parts that can be pulled off. It doesn't have any music or noise or batteries or anything like that. If you're going to give it to him in the crib or the bed. Let's see, is there anyone else that I haven't gotten to? We talked to Megan, Kelsey, Britton. Megan, Holly. So since we don't have any questions, I'll go over some most common questions that I usually get from families. And one of them is like when to make the transition into a toddler bed. I think I said this a little bit earlier. I don't recommend transitioning to a toddler bed until they're nighttime potty trained, when they need to get up and go to the bathroom. You want them to be able to do that, so a toddler bed is great for that. But if they're not asking to go to the bathroom, they're not nighttime potty trained, they're still in diapers, you can keep them in the crib. Cribs are rated to have children that weigh 40, 50 pounds. So there's no rush to get them out of the crib. I think a lot of times parents transition them way too early. Sometimes it's because there's another baby coming and you want to put the baby in the crib. So they transition the toddler into a toddler bed and use the crib. I say borrow another crib, buy a crib, use a pack and play travel crib for the infant. You can have them in just a bassinet by the bed. They don't need a crib for quite some time, especially since the new AAP recommendations of keeping the infant in the room with the parents for at least a minimum of 6 months to a year. So a lot of times there isn't room in a parent's room for a bed and a dresser and all the things, all the furniture you have, plus a crib. So keep that crib for the toddler. And use whatever you need to for the infant. And then, like I said, they're not going to need a crib for potentially 6 or 12 months. And even if your toddler is not nighttime potty trained by the time the infant is ready for their crib in their own room, see if you can, like I said, borrow a crib. Now you can purchase cribs in consignment or whatever. But it's better not to transition that child out of the crib and into a toddler bed before they're ready. And a lot of times they're not ready until they're nighttime potty trained, which can be around between 2 and 4 years of age. That's when they understand rewards and consequences. Obviously, if they are jumping out and it's not safe for them to stay in the crib, then you have to transition them earlier. But it's best not to do it because you need the crib. Holly said, I tried bringing to the pediatrician. So, like I said, medications sometimes are warranted. She said that the pediatrician advised to put him on meds. Sometimes meds are valuable, but a lot of times with most kids, it's behavioral, and they've gotten into this behavioral rut because of something happened. There was an illness, a developmental milestone, travel that caused a child who was sleeping really well to kind of go off the rails. And so it's what you do and how you respond to that that determines whether they're going to go off track and have a recession, or just be off track and not be able to sleep anymore. So if, you know, during the travel, everybody was in the same hotel room and sleeping together in the same room, in the same bed, and then you guys come back to the house and then you kind of keep doing that, then the child's going to be like, oh, I didn't realize this, you know, maybe we could do that when we're traveling, but I didn't realize we could do this at home too. Well, now I demand it. I want it at home every single night. And then the parent's like, all right, I'll give in because I'm tired. I don't feel like dealing with the fight. And then it's hard to kind of get out of it. So setting up that boundary, deciding with you and your partner what the plan is going to be, and kind of sticking to it. Getting both or all the caregivers on the same page is really crucial. I hear all the time, dad wants to do it one way or mom wants to do it another way, or the caregivers during the day, typically grandparents, want to do it a different way, and everyone's doing it different ways, which makes it confusing for the child. And so they're going to act out and try to get that attention any way they can. And especially if they, kids just want their parents. They want their parents all day, every day, all night, every night. And, most parents want their kids too. But to establish good sleep habits doesn't mean you don't have to love your kid and be with your kid. You can definitely always do that. But it is typically better for everyone to have their long quality sleep. If that's all happening in a family bed, great, do it. If it's not, that's when you need to figure out a way and what to do to change. So it's a matter of figuring out what works for your family, picking a strategy, and then sticking with it. It's when parents are tired overnight that you give in to certain things, and then it makes it even harder. So it's worth deciding on a plan, sticking with it, and figuring out, is it behavioral? Is it that they're hungry? Is it that they are going through a growth spurt and have been eating a lot more, and they just have been too distracted during the day to eat, so they're trying to make up that intake during the day? Or it could be a mom is starting to go back to work and she's nursing, and now that she's pumping and there isn't as much to feed, or the child doesn't like the bottle as much, so the baby, because the mom is gone all day, tries to make up that intake at night. So there's always some sort of trigger. It's figuring out what that trigger is and kind of backtracking and saying, okay, they were feeding really well and sleeping well, but now they're waking up and feeding multiple times overnight. Well, that means that they probably need more intake during the day. And if you improve that intake during the day and they're still waking up multiple times, then you know that it's just become a habit, and you have to work towards eliminating that habit. Does that make sense? I hope so. I really wish I could talk with you guys as well and hear your questions, but that's not so much the case on Facebook Live, it seems. Let's see. Oh yes, I did